All right, welcome back to the Anastasis Center channel here on YouTube. I'm Mako Nagasawa, the director, and I'm here with Vince Bantu, Dr. Vince Bantu, who is a good friend and also eminently qualified to be talking about the theology of Black Panther here as we chat about that, and especially look at the role of Wakanda and why it is that it's just so fascinating to think about kind of a Afro-futurist utopia. And I want to give a little bit of that background to Vince here. Vince got his doctorate in Semitic and Egyptian languages from the Catholic University of America. And Vince's dissertation kind of combined his interests in African Christianity and social identity. He teaches at Fuller Seminary as a professor of church history and Black church studies. And also, he founded and directs the Meachum School of Haymanot, or the Gospel, which provides theological education for urban pastors and leaders. He's author of many books, most recently, A Multitude of All Peoples, Engaging Ancient Christianity's Global Identity. So I am thrilled, Vince, that you could be here with me again. Thank you so much for carving out some time.
Oh, no, it's a pleasure to be here, my brother.
So at our last session, we looked at just the global context of the major theme of imperialism and colonizing. So and we talked about the golden thread that runs through the 20th century of Christian or Christian-led or Christian-inspired nonviolent resistance movements against empire, against injustice and oppression. And of course, the Black Panthers in Oakland were part of that. That connects with the larger African-American struggle for civil rights and human rights. And if folks have not seen that before, please go check it out, because Vince and I just had a great conversation about that. Today, we're going to talk about Wakanda. And again, Vince, please stop me, interrupt me at any point in time where you want to throw in a comment here and there. I'm for sure going to ask you some things, but this is a presentation that I put together after Black Panther 1 came out, and it just sparked so many thoughts back then, and I'm sure it'll spark more today. And again, Vince, thanks so much for being here. So we'll dive in.
Mm-hmm.
The amazing thing about Wakanda, aside from all its beauty, cultural diversity, traditions, and the way it's portrayed, is it seems to it reminded me a lot of a chosen people and a chosen people mystique. What do I mean by that? In real history, there is kind of a mystique around Ethiopia, and Vince, please chime in if there are other countries or cultures or tribal identities that also play this role. But what I'm aware of is that because Ethiopia was never colonized, it also it serves as this analogy to Wakanda, because Wakanda was never colonized, and in the in-universe Marvel story that it's telling. But in our real history, I mean, there's been a lot of mystique around Ethiopia. So there are Jewish Ethiopians there who trace their descent back to, like, the Queen of Sheba, who visited with King Solomon, and maybe even earlier than that. I don't know, but I know at least there is that tradition. And then there was Emperor Haile Selassie, who in the 20th century was in power. And I guess the idea that some Rastafarians had, that maybe he was the Messiah, like he was descended from David through, Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, and a union that they had. So that was an idea, although I think he pushed back on that, and he said, please don't say that about me. It is not true. And he even asked the Ethiopian Orthodox Church to send a leader over to the Caribbean in order to kind of teach the Orthodox faith. And I think Bob Marley came to Christ, gave his life to Christ shortly before he died as a result of that, and as he kind of transitioned from the Rastafarian belief system into the Ethiopian Orthodox Christian tradition. Anyway, I mean, there's a lot of mystique, I think, around Ethiopia, and it's just fun to interpret the longing for this this idea of what kind of people would we be, what would our culture be like if we were never colonized. And Wakanda serves as a little bit of a kind of a rich imaginative exercise of that. Would you say anything else? I mean, how did Wakanda as a whole strike you, Vince? Is there something about that?
That's, I mean, I've said the same thing like over and over, that, when Black Panther came out, Ethiopia has always been like just kind of it's always been my favorite place to study and to talk about, because I'm really interested in early African history, or pre-colonial African history in general, just because I love to really highlight the history of Black people, free from European colonialism, just because so much of Black history is often kind of like couched as a response to white supremacy. And I think there's a lot of importance in that, but I also think that it's important for Black people to define their experience and identity, also apart from white supremacy as well, so that we don't get into this mentality of thinking that who we are is essentially just a response to something, or like and so that's why I really love to focus on African history before colonialism, and especially Christianity, as a believer. And so in that space, in that context, I end up talking a lot about North Africa or Egypt or Nubia. And even now I'm looking a lot at the Trans-Saharan and Indian Ocean trade, and trying to understand more about even how different African civilizations interacted with each other in the medieval period. But out of all of those different contexts, I've always felt like Ethiopia is my absolute favorite one to talk about, just because of all these things that we're talking about. The fact that it was a Sub-Saharan African, Black community, because there's this racial distinction between North and Sub-Saharan Africa, and I think that in church history we always talk about the North African, church fathers and mothers, like from Egypt and North Africa, and Tertullian and Athanasius and Origen and Cyril and Cyprian, and all those folks, and that's fine. I mean, they are African as well, but there's like a linguistic and cultural and imperial and also even racial distinction. And so I think there should be more attention on Sub-Saharan Africa. But even in comparison to Nubia, there was a lot more of especially in terms of Christianity, there was a lot more of kind of a deference to a more Romanized or Byzantine expression of Christianity. But with Ethiopia, not only was it a Black Sub-Saharan African context, but the Christianity was a lot more contextualized and more indigenized. And as you pointed out, it's never been colonized. So when Black Panther came out and everybody was imagining, oh, wouldn't it be great if we had a Wakanda, or wouldn't it be great if there was a place like that had never been colonized, and it was a place that was fully run by and kind of free of these colonial imprints. I was always saying, well, there is a place like that and it's called Ethiopia. That we have a real life Wakanda, so we don't need to just imagine it, but we can also connect to, in many ways, our real life Wakanda. And the other thing, just real quick, the other thing I would say, especially talking about Rastafarianism, I think it's also important to point out, that Ethiopianism is actually just a whole movement unto itself in the diaspora and across the continent. That in the late 1800s, going into the 1900s, there's this phenomenon known as Ethiopianism, where in South Africa and in Jamaica, people like Marcus Garvey and the people all over the diaspora and on the continent would look to Ethiopia in this way. So it's not just me saying, that, or me and you here saying, oh, there's this connection with Ethiopia serving as this Black utopia, as Wakanda did in the movie. But that's how Black people around the world have been looking at Ethiopia for over a century and a half now, with this movement called Ethiopianism, where Black people, especially in places of oppression and colonization, look to Ethiopia as this source of inspiration. So I think that's worth noting as well.
That is amazing. I had no idea. So Vince, I I learn a ton from you every time we talk. I know you went to Ethiopia with your family. You were able to see the rock-hewn churches and the beautiful art there. And so at any time, please chime in with some of that. And I recall something about how the Jesuits were trying to infiltrate Ethiopia and promote the the Catholic tradition at the expense of the Orthodox tradition, but they also had great respect for the Ethiopian Christian tradition and Ethiopian culture and people in general, which kind of shows the lie that the Jesuits promoted in other sectors of their organization when they were involved in colonizing, right? I mean, in the Americas, there was a belief that who was it? I think his name is Acosta, and Willie James Jennings talks about this, where the Jesuits promoted this idea that intelligence was connected to race typologies, right? And so that white Europeans were very civilized, and even you could even evangelize them using rationality, versus Asians and to some degree Native Americans were barbarian, but they also had high intelligence, and you could use some rationality, versus Africans and were not rational, and their theory was that's why we could enslave Africans. And yet, how is it that, I mean, they were trying to infiltrate Ethiopia and recognize the cultural superiority, and they had great respect for Ethiopia. I mean, this is the same organization, so how could they say these things? Just crazy.
Yeah. No, it was crazy. And one of the things I think one of the really interesting things about that whole situation is that, yeah, like, even unfortunately, that there was even a top down in Ethiopia in the 1600s. There was even this top down imposition of European Catholicism by the king of Ethiopia, who wanted to have an ally as he was fighting the Muslims in the Horn of Africa. And that was kind of probably his motivation, because the Ethiopians had been in war with the Adal and Ifat sultanates in modern Somalia for the last 200 years, 300 years before that time. But at that time, the 1600s, the Ethiopians were losing power in the Horn of Africa, whereas in the 13 and 1400s they were more dominant. And so the king of Ethiopia, Facilitus, he decided to embrace Portuguese alliance, and the Portuguese and other Europeans were always searching through Africa. They were always looking for this mystical figure called Prester John, or Elder John. And there's these stories of, like, Marco Polo and William Rupert going to Central Asia and going to all kinds of places looking for this mystical Christian king. And then they came to Ethiopia and found out it was a Christian kingdom and felt they finally found Prester John. And but despite the fact that they had at that time a 1300-year-old Christian tradition, and longer than the Portuguese had been Christian, they were still this sense of superiority. And there was a whole, I mean, I don't want to get us off track too much history, but just say quickly, there was a church council in the year 451 that actually had split the Christianity of Egypt and Ethiopia and Nubia from the Christianity of Europe. So when they came in, they would have not recognized the Christianity in Ethiopia as Orthodox from their perspective, from a European perspective. And so, and vice versa. And so when King Facilitus had decided to, from the top down, impose European Catholicism in Ethiopia, most of the Ethiopians rejected this, because they were like, we have our own tradition, we have our own, and actually one of the leaders in that movement was a woman actually named Walata Petros. And Walata Petros, her name means daughter of Peter, and she was a monastic leader, and she galvanized almost the whole country against the king. Even actually her husband was a imperial official, so even her own husband was trying to force her to subscribe to European Catholicism, and she rejected her husband and her king. And she was on the run, actually. Her own husband and her king were trying to kill her, and she was brought before the king, and she actually says to the king, beginning, she says, we will not accept the, and I'm quoting her own biography here, we won't accept the filthy faith of the Europeans, is what she said, and that we have our own faith. And so she continued to hold strong in this way. And then King Fasilides' son, King Sasanius, actually reversed that policy and re-embraced the original indigenous Ethiopian Christianity, and then exonerated Volata Petros. And to this day, she's actually one of the few Ethiopian women saints. And actually, her biography, which you can read in English translation, is actually one of the earliest biographies ever written about a Sub-Saharan African Black woman in human history. And you know, so yeah, just, you know, wanted to mention that as well. But
this is amazing. Wow. So friends, if you're listening to this on video, this is all the reason to look up Dr. Vince Bantu and take anything that he teaches by his books. Please do yourself a favor and let this man play a role in how, you know, your sense of church history is shaped, because Vince has made those incredible investments in himself. And again, I totally benefit from it every time I talk to him. So, wow. Well, let's move on. Let's get back to Black Panther. I mean, we do see Ethiopia even called out by Ryan Coogler. Here's the symbol of the Ethiopian cross being worn by the elder who represents Ethiopia. She was on the King's Council, right? Oh, this lovely lady just passed away recently. Dorothy, I'm forgetting her name, unfortunately.
Yeah, me too.
But yes, very dignified person. And so we're not making this up, right? Like in Black Panther, the movie itself, Ethiopian Christianity is actually put on display. That's incredible. Here's another picture of her. And this is an actual Ethiopian cross, the way it's designed. And this picture down below is called Lalibela, and it is a church sanctuary carved out of rock. Vince, I think I remember seeing you and your family posing for a picture outside one of these at this location. What was that like?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, my family hasn't been able to go yet, and that's one of our big goals in life. And
okay,
Lord willing, this ceasefire will you know, continue, and you know, and for, you know, more reasons than just that we can go there. But
right.
But yeah, unfortunately, these areas haven't been accessible for the last few years now because of the conflict there. But yeah, I was able to go, you know, about 5-6 years ago. And actually, if anybody looks me up on Facebook, I'm standing in front of that church. That's like the, you know, basically the highlight of my life in terms of visiting places. And
wow,
and it was, yeah, it's just amazing to go to this church. And you know, and it's actually interesting. The cross that they're wearing in Black Panther, and the one we have here is actually known among Ethiopians as the Aksumite cross, because Aksum as a city was the capital of Ethiopia from the 1st century up until about the like 9th or 10th century. And then it declined, and some people think there was tension between the Christian kingdom of Aksum and local Ethiopian Jewish kingdoms. Other people think it may have been with Muslim conflicts, but then in this city, Lalibela, it actually reemerged as a new capital of Ethiopia under King Gebre Meskel Lalibela in the 12th century. And they actually have their own style of cross so there's a Lalibela style cross, and it actually has kind of a circular floral looking design around it. And it looks also, so there's multiple unique styles of crosses in Ethiopia. But yeah, the one they have there in the movie is what's called the Aksumite style. And another interesting thing about, you know, just the fact that I think another thing that's interesting to point out about the inclusion of that in like Black Panther, and especially in the first movie, in those scenes where the different tribes are, you know, there's so much African religious imagery and practice all throughout the movie. And this is what lamentably to me actually caused a big backlash in the Christian community, even in the Black Christian community, of, you know, having this like fear of African spirituality, you know, which, I mean, I don't want to get off on a tangent, but I would say, as you know, as Christians, of course, we have to be, you know, careful and biblical about how we engage practices and things like that. and we have to do things according to Scripture and the Holy Spirit. But at the same time, as cultural beings, all of us are, all of our cultures are made in the image of God. And so there's beauty, and there's things that align with all of our cultures that are in line with the Word of God. And it's impossible to completely strip ourselves of our pre-Christian thought and language and practices. And we have to look at Scripture. Even God actually embraces things that didn't originate with Hebrew, pure like religious culture. Like even the name El, when he calls himself El Shaddai or Elohim, that name actually originates from Canaanite paganism, and Moses probably actually learned that name from Jethro, who was not a Hebrew, and it's included. And then John calls Jesus the Logos. That's not a that's a pagan Greek term and concept that's brought in. So anyway, so I think that and we do that all the time with European culture. I mean, we just got through, everybody's probably right now taking down their Christmas trees. Well, Christmas trees come from Saxon pagan culture, and they were incorporated as a Christian tradition. And we don't all like say, oh, that's demonic. Or I mean, actually, there are some people who do, but it's impossible to get away from it, because then you have to stop saying Wednesday and Thursday and Friday, which these are all days of Norse gods like Thor and Frigga, and I mean, we can't get away from it. It's part of and God doesn't want us to, because He created us. And so anyway, we have to find ways to biblically embrace culture. And so I just I think that, but I think especially cultures that have been so marginalized by Western culture, especially Western Christianity. I mean, a lot of indigenous Native American Christians really struggle with this of people saying, oh, you can't do a sweat lodge, or you can't do smudging for Jesus in Jesus' name. But again, there's so many of examples of Martin Luther taking beer drinking songs and turning them into hymns. So why can't indigenous or African people do that? So anyway, I didn't mean to get off on the soliloquy, but I just wanted to point out that I think it's really I think that it's really in many ways a good thing to see African spirituality being elevated. But I also just think it's really important that Ethiopian Christianity in particular and imagery is included in that scene in the movie, where you have all of this African spirituality, and Ethiopian Christianity in particular is included in that, because John Mbiti was African philosopher, and he famously said that he writes on just African religious indigenous religions and philosophies. And he actually included Ethiopian Christianity in particular and classified it as an indigenous African religion. And I just think that's so crucial to look at, because in the global Black community and in the global community in general, people don't think of Christianity as an African religion, that it's often seen as a European religion, or maybe as a Middle Eastern religion, because that's where Jesus and the apostles came from. But when we look at the fact that there were Africans involved from the very beginning, the eunuch from Acts 8, that from the very beginning, some of those Hebrews were Africans, and then how Christianity grew in Ethiopia free from colonialism, it really can be considered, Ethiopian Christianity in particular, can truly be considered an indigenous African religion.
Fascinating, Vince. Fascinating. Well, let's dig in some more to this. I'm eager to hear what you say about some of the ways I've been impressed by Black Panther and this portrayal of Wakanda. So here are some of the main points that I was struck by. That Wakanda, as a chosen people, receives a gift from above, and that is vibranium. It takes a while for them to adjust to the gift, which is shown in that animated segment at the beginning of the movie, where there's tribal conflict, and then they move to a unity. Although the Jabari tribe continues to kind of maintain their independence, which is fascinating. There's a very strong emphasis on men and women and the relationships between men and women as kind of, this is the way it should be, or this is the way it could be. There is a union of humanity and the gift itself. So the heart-shaped herb is the herb that grows next to vibranium, and in some ways contains its power, and there's some mystical power there too. And finally, that there is a king of Wakanda who's the chosen one, and kind of embodies defense of Wakanda, but also in some ways is an ambassador of Wakanda to the world. And those are the things that I thought were cool. I'll just breeze through this for anyone who needs a refresher on the movie. You know, this is Vibranium, the Gift from Above, which is this the picture of the Wakandans mining vibranium here. They put it in everything. Obviously, there's weapons, but there's also medical uses. There's technological uses that's used in communication and defense and so on. And what's neat, what's neat, I think, is that there's a parallel to Israel's experience as a chosen people, because they received the gift of God's presence. So first, you know, God descends in fire on the burning bush and on Mount Sinai, and then on Mount Zion. And there's a way in which they're constantly adjusting to God's presence. In Wakanda, there's tribal conflict and then unity. This is the scene from Warrior Falls. And the same thing is true in Israel's history too. There's tribal conflict, even among the 12 original brothers. This is a picture of Joseph being stripped of his robe. But then there's unity on the other side of that. There's, you know, the strong emphasis on the way it should be, especially between men and women. The power of women in Wakanda is stunning. But also there's a lot of amazing things in the Old Testament as to how women are treated, starting from, well, really Genesis 2 and Genesis 4, where the ideal of, you know, a monogamous marriage that becomes its own family unit, where, you know, at the end of Genesis 2, it says a man will leave his father and mother. Like, speaking as someone of Japanese descent, I'm aware of quite a few cultures where they just wouldn't say that, where, you know, the opposite is true. It's when a man and woman get married, you know, the wife becomes leaves her family and joins her husband's family as the lowest ranking member of his family. Right. And instead, in Genesis 2, there's this picture of, no, a man leaves his father and mother, and the new married unit becomes kind of a new Adam and Eve, and they inherit their portion of a garden land. And from there, that enables women to actually lead in society. So you have Miriam, the sister of Moses in Exodus 15, leading the people in worship. You have Deborah, who is just an outstanding leader, prophetess and judge in Judges 4 and 5. Her words are recorded as scripture. And then Huldah in 2 Kings 22 advises King Josiah on how to interpret the law, how to interpret the Sinai covenant. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So it just, there's amazing things. And in the history, in Old Testament history, and then in the intertestamental period, there's even women who actually serve as kings. There's Queen Athaliah, and then there's Salome. That's okay. There's a woman who serves as basically the kind of the emperor of Judah, and I'll put her name in the notes there. It's so just incredible things in the Old Testament. In Wakanda, there's this union of humanity and the gift in the form of they eat the heart-shaped herb. And, you know, one of the ways that Israel experienced union of humanity and the gift is when Moses goes up the Mount Sinai and his face begins to glow as well. Yeah, so Moses goes up the mountain, meets with God, and he, in some sense, becomes cleansed by God, becomes one with God. His face begins to shine with divine light. I mean, there's a real union of humanity and the gift, and that continues on in other places, like Isaiah 6. Isaiah sees a vision of God, and then in his vision, his lips are cleansed by a burning coal from the altar that represents the flames, the divine fire that descended on Mount Sinai, right? So there's a retelling of Moses' story that's institutionalized in the tabernacle and the temple, and Isaiah is similarly cleansed by that. So again, a union of humanity and the gift. And then there's the whole thing of who is the king of Wakanda in terms of what's his job description, right? And so he represents Bast, the Panther goddess. And then there's a debate that plays out in Black Panther, the movie, about at least two visions for Wakanda and the world. And there's union with Bast, and the Black Panther is wrapped in the mantle of Bast, in the same way that the Messiah would be thought of as somehow more deeply united with the God of Israel and wrapped in the mantle of the God of Israel. And so just some, things that come to my mind as I look at Black Panther. Why is Wakanda so attractive? Is Wakanda a better version of ourselves? That it not only was it not colonized, which is huge when we think about trauma these days, and the ways in which sometimes the relationship between men and women is affected and kind of shaped poorly if there are oppressive factors. So that is a major factor to look at Wakanda with great wonder, and in some ways kind of inspired imagination, but also because Wakanda was not a colonizer. And I think that also is really significant, especially as we continue to wrestle with the legacy of colonialism and the reality that it continues. I mean, even in the US, how many territories, does the US control? Puerto Rico, Guam, and so on, that at Washington, D.C., where the Constitution does not follow, right? People, they don't have a vote. So the U.S. is an empire. So it's really significant that Wakanda has this power that vibranium gave them, that the Black Panther has this power that vibranium gives him, but they don't use it to become colonizers. I mean, that's just amazing. And so, these questions of we would be like this if only, I think those are important questions to ask. And then where else can we look from actual history, right? I mean, the amazing thing about Black Panther is it draws from actual history, or at least it purports to. And in actual history, there are instances where obviously we could look at the Old Testament and the Hebrew scriptures and the experience of Israel before Jesus and say that's really significant. It's an argument itself for the truth of scripture. Like, who would have invented a man will leave his father and mother? There's no patriarchal culture that I can imagine that I know of that would have invented that. But also we look at real history of when has Christian faith played this kind of role. We could look at Nubia, where 3 kingdoms unified when their rulers became Christians at around the same time. And or we could look at Ethiopia, and Christian Ethiopia in particular, as a continuous civilization. And I would love to know how long were they not colonizers? I mean, Haile Selassie was called emperor, but why was he called emperor? Or we could look even at other places, perhaps Kerala, India, perhaps Armenia, Georgia, other places that became very influenced by Christian faith early. We tend not to know their history. I mean, and especially because in Western Christian circles, we tend to look at Christian faith in other places as if it was just a novelty and there's nothing that we could really learn from. So those are some things that come to my mind. I mean, I would love to hear your thoughts, Vince. What do you see in this? Do you see similar things and maybe even more?
Yeah, no, I think there's definitely a lot of I would agree with all of this, and there's a lot of parallels. I thought it was really interesting, the parallels with biblical Israel and Wakanda, and then also I think that again, going with the theme of Ethiopia, I think even one analogy we could make, I mean, with vibranium as the gift, I think there's so many parallels in real life African history that you could that people could make, especially with what started drawing Europeans to Africa, for gold or for copper or these different Africa being one of the most mineral rich continents in the world that you know, that led to a lot of colonization, and then even like human beings themselves, and then,
Oh,
you know,
still
we're in the
today in Congo and cobalt, right?
hmm
Yeah.
oh yeah, that's right, yeah. And so, you know, I think there's a lot of, you know, ways that we could you know, kind of make analogies to actual resources. And with
Mm,
the Ethiopia, I think another I don't even know if this would have been you know, in the mindset, but if we're talking about Ethiopia as a real life Wakanda, um I think that we could even kind of associate that with the idea of the gift of the Ark of the Covenant being in Ethiopia. That, you know, you mentioned earlier about the idea of the Queen of Sheba being, you know, having a son with, you know, King Solomon, and then later that son was you know, he well, he didn't bring, but he some people who came with him, you know, according to the Mako Nagasawa, brought the Ark of the Covenant to Ethiopia. And then the text, which, you know, this is one of the earliest you know, original texts written in the Ge'ez language, and it's like a an origin story of their people, and it talks about how literally this gift of the Ark passed over into from Israel into Ethiopia. So it really presents, the text presents Ethiopia as this kind of new Israel, that we are now the bearers of God's presence in this world. And you know, God chose for his ark to pass away from, because of Solomon's sin and
wow.
because of his worldliness. God chose that gift would pass over from Israel into Ethiopia, and but also that the line of Israel now is through Ethiopia, through the Solomonic dynasty, and Menelik, the son of Queen of Sheba, going all the way to Haile Selassie. And so so even that could, and then it's, you know, the idea in Ethiopia is that the ark is still there, and it's in a small chapel in the city of Axum, which we referred earlier, which is the capital city of Ethiopia in the first millennium, and it's still there to this day according to Ethiopian tradition. And so
Wow.
there's still this gift, right? The God, there's literally God's presence in Ethiopia. Just kind of what that, you know, I mean, obviously there's a lot of questions about the historicity or the veracity of that, but if that's the mentality, you know, in Ethiopian society, then how does that affect people's mentality
Right.
and people's psyche of, like, we are literally the God's chosen people, and we have this literal gift that God has chosen to be in our land. But yeah.
Wow. That is, yeah, I mean, that's fascinating. In a, I wonder if that leads to a just a concern for balancing life in a certain way, in a respectful way. So, for instance, I know that there's some Ethiopian Orthodox leaders who are trying to protect the forests of Ethiopia from big coffee companies that are, you know, trying to come in, clear out the forest, and make more arable land for to grow coffee. And you know, I have to admit, like, oh, Ethiopian coffee is my favorite coffee, and maybe there is something magical or spiritual and supernatural or just very good about the soil. But in any case, like there's a concern that the Ethiopian church has to protect lands and forests and things like that. And I know some of it is related to, well, the forest used to traditionally owned by the church. Still, I mean, it is an important gesture in today's world. And you know, I think it gets at this question of what is greatness. I mean, maybe you know, is greatness found in the ability to turn nature into money? Is that greatness? Or is it something else? Is it the pursuit of a balanced, holistic life?
Mm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, no, I think that's a great question. I mean, maybe it could even be you know, a point of critique for both the movie and even a lot of ancient or medieval African Christian history, because I
Mm,
think another sobering reality we got to look at is I mean, you had mentioned earlier, is like how long were people uh when they're using these terms like empire and emperor, and again, even the text that I was referring to is called the Book of the Kings, right? Or the Emperors. The Kaber Nagast is the emperors. And actually the unfortunate reality is Ethiopia did actually itself act as a colonizer, especially in the 14th century under King Amda Seyon. And Amda Seyon was the king of Ethiopia in the 1300s, and he was kind of went on his own like crusade throughout the Horn of Africa and was conquering and even imposing Christianity in surrounding communities that may have been Jewish or may have been practiced traditional African religions, and especially the biggest opponent for him were Islamic empires, in modern Somalia. And so there were several examples of under his leadership, and other kings as well, not just him, but Zaria Kob and Dawit the First, that there were many examples of Ethiopian kings themselves acting as colonizers, even within the Horn of Africa. And so, and the same is true, we mentioned Nubia, but the same is true, according to Ethiopian sources, and actually other sources as well, that there's examples of Christian Nubia also acting as a colonizer and conquering neighboring kingdoms in modern day Darfur or modern day Chad to the west, of conquering people as well as nomadic peoples along the Red Sea, and also imposing Christianity. In fact, Ethiopia went to war with Nubia, according to the king, the first Christian king of Ethiopia. His name is Ezana, in the 300s, and he actually says that after he embraced Christianity, he went to war with Nubia and fought them because they in turn were oppressing surrounding African people groups, and those groups had cried out to help from Ethiopia. And so there's all kinds of examples, unfortunately, of even within indigenous non-colonial African context of people acting as colonizers. And so we can look at even the movie Black Panther of there's still this sense of, again, using vibranium to create weapons and to become militarized and weaponized. And there's still this, we were talking about the different options of which way they can go, of being involved in the world or being kind of hidden or closed off, or being colonizers. But I think the through line through all of those choices is still militarization and being willing to use violence to protect their people's interests. And I think that's a unfortunate requisite of empire across the board, and is even true in ancient African context. But it also just kind of, for me at least, it just kind of helps bring a sobering mentality or realization that colonization or oppression is not unique to the Western European world, but that it's unfortunately a human tendency that all of us can fall into.
That is so sobering, and yet how valuable it is to know that history and to be able to offer some critique of our own tradition, and to say, like, well, we worship Jesus, we don't worship any particular other person. So and what that means is that we're willing to critique it and to compare it to Jesus, and to allow ourselves to be critiqued by Jesus. There's just so much, and I will be appreciating your question then about the movie Black Panther, that yes, there's some idealism there, but maybe it can serve a helpful purpose, right? I'm struck by how the tribes, when they first receive the vibranium, they have to work it out and work out an arrangement that they're going to hold together. But the Jabari tribe leaves, and they're somehow, in the orbit of the other tribes, and they're present. And we'll see what Ryan Coogler has in store for M'Baku and the Jabari tribe in the next few movies. That'll be exciting. But they did not colonize the Jabari. That's fascinating. So I really appreciate that. And again, it's really significant to not be colonized. I think it's just as significant, perhaps even more so, to not be the colonizer. So, so Vince, why don't we hit a pause button here on our discussion, and when we return next time, we'll be looking at kind of the contrasting visions put forward by Killmonger and T'Challa about what it means to be what it means to offer the gift to the world. So I want to thank you again for joining me and being present here, and I look forward to the next time.
Oh, me too, brother.
Thanks so much.